his gauntlet, cold and forged from the metals of his harsh northern homeland, scraped against the ugly bracer that had been a permanent fixture on my wrist for 15 years. It was a sound that tore through the suffocating silence of the great Haller Euros, a dissonant shriek of metal against metal. But this was no simple contact. It was a catalyst, a key turning in a lock I never knew existed. The ancient alloy of his glove, designed to channel the very soul of an Alpha, awakened something dormant within me. The runes etched into my bracer, once a mere annoyance against my skin, erupted in a blinding, blue-white incandescence. The air itself seemed to shatter, crackling with a raw, untamed magic. The metal that had been a cold, dead weight on my arm for a decade and a half suddenly felt like a star, superheating in an instant. A cry was torn from my throat as I staggered back, watching in horror as hairline fractures, like forks of lightning, spread across its surface. And then, the dam broke. For the first time in my entire existence, a scent billowed from my body. It was not a scent. It was a deluge, a cataclysmic force of nature unleashed upon a world that had only ever known me as a void. It wasn't the faint, pleasing aroma of a typical omega. This was something ancient, primal, and terrifyingly complex. It was a symphony of fragrances that had no place in the sterile, dust-filled air of the scriptorium. It carried the scent of deep, rich earth moments after a cleansing rain, the aroma of ancient, untouched forests teeming with life, the sweetness of wild honey warmed by the sun, and the crisp, clean tang of ozone that hangs in the air just before a lightning strike. It was the scent of life itself, of raw power, of untamed, primordial magic. It was the undeniable, world-altering scent of a prime omega. The effect was absolute. Every Alpha in the hall, from the stoic guards flanking the massive doors to the wizened masters on the grand dais, collapsed to their knees. They bowed their heads as one, gasping for air as if it had been violently ripped from their lungs, their instincts forcing them into a state of total submission. The other Omegas swayed on their feet, their eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and a terror so profound it bordered on religious awe. But my eyes were only on him, Lord Commander Wayland. The force of my released scent had thrown him back a full step. His hand was clamped over his nose and mouth, a futile gesture against an unstoppable tide. His cold, winter-gray eyes, which had moments before held nothing but clinical dismissal, were now blown wide with a volatile cocktail of shock, disbelief, and something else, Euros, something far more dangerous. It was a wild, dark, and possessive hunger that was terrifying to behold. The carefully constructed mask of the indifferent warlord had been utterly annihilated. In its place was the raw, instinctual visage of an Alpha who had just stumbled upon the very center of his universe. He began to move toward me, his steps no longer measured and deliberate, but driven by a purpose so fierce it felt like a physical force. He seized my arm, his grip a manacle of iron. His eyes, stormy and gray, locked onto mine, and the entire world, with its gasping Alphas and trembling Omegas, narrowed to the inescapable intensity of his gaze. "You," he growled. The single word was not a question or an observation. It was a vow. It was a claim. It was a life sentence. My life had been an exercise in understanding silence. I first truly comprehended its nature not in the absence of noise, but in the heart of the scriptorium, a place filled with the soft, persistent sounds of existence. I would trace the spine of a book bound in cracking hydro-leather, listening to the dry whisper of ancient parchment turning, the distant, rhythmic scratch of a quill on vellum, the gentle sigh of dust motes pirouetting in the brilliant shafts of sunlight that pierced the high, vaulted windows. This was a different kind of silence. It was a hollowness of the soul, a vacuum in the very air around me that others filled effortlessly with their presence, with the unique perfume of their biology. I could only occupy this space with my physical form, a silent apology for a genetic failing. They called me Amir. To the masters, I was Scholar Amir, their most brilliant student, a mind capable of resurrecting the dead languages of the first dynasties from their textual graves. But to the other Omegers, I was simply Amir, the scentless one, a nullity, a flaw in the grand tapestry of our world, a world defined by the fragrant and unspoken language of our biology. In this world, I was utterly mute. The whispers that followed me were rarely malicious. They were far worse. They were saturated with a pity that felt more like a brand than a kindness. Such a remarkable intellect. I would overhear them murmur, their voices hushed as they observed me, lost in a scroll, completely wasted in a body that cannot summon an Alpha. What a tragedy! I learned to build walls of indifference, pretending their words were nothing more than the rustling of pages. I would lose myself in the intricate knotwork of a forgotten map, recalling my mother's voice, a warm and secret thing in the small room we once shared. Look beyond the ink, my Amir, she had taught me, her finger tracing the flow of a river across the vellum. The truth isn't in the image, but in the intention of the hand that drew it. She was also the one who had fastened the bracelet to my wrist. It was a heavy, graceless thing, forged from a dull, non-reflective metal, its surface etched with runes that would prickle against my skin like phantom needles if I focused on them too intently. "You must never, ever take this off," she had commanded, her eyes dark with a fear my young mind couldn't begin to decipher. "Swear it to me." And I had sworn. For 15 years, it had been a cold, constant companion on my wrist, a reminder of a promise whose purpose remained a mystery, just another piece of my perceived brokenness. The great scriptorium of Silverwood was less a sanctuary of knowledge and more a gilded prison for Omegers like myself, the unsuitable. We were the ones with irregular heats, frail constitutions, or, in my singular and unnerving case, a scent profile that was a perfect, absolute zero. We were deemed unfit for bonding, unfit for carrying on the great lines of the Alpha clans. So, we were given to knowledge instead, tasked with the preservation of the histories of the very families who considered us unworthy. The cruel poetry of this irony was not lost on me. We were the memory of a world that desperately wished to forget we existed. While the great Alpha clans sent us their histories to be archived, they never sent for the archivists. There was a quiet power in that, a silent rebellion in the meticulous care we lavished on their stories. We knew their secrets, their shames, the fragile foundations upon which their towering legacies were built. They saw us as sterile blossoms, fit only for decorating a hall of knowledge, forgetting that the quietest scholars often wield the most incisive minds. I was meticulously arranging a collection of pre-cataclysmic poetry when the summons shattered the scriptorium's tranquil atmosphere. The air, usually so still and heavy with the scent of old paper, suddenly crackled with an anxious, electric energy. Omegers began to cluster in the corridors, their individual scents spiking with a pathetic cocktail of fear and desperate, foolish hope. I caught fragmented whispers carried on the agitated air. Lord Commander Welina Euros a circumflex Euros from the northern west Sir Euros a circumflex Euros an ancient treaty demands Eater Euros a circumflex Euros he is coming to select a mate. A distant, academic curiosity was all I felt. The northern wastes were a harsh, unforgiving territory, ruled by a man whose reputation for brutal pragmatism preceded him. Waylon had lost his first mate and his only heir during the Ember War a decade prior and had ruled in solitary grief ever since, a grim specter haunting the continent's northern edge. The treaty that now bound him to choose a mate from our scriptorium was a dusty relic, a political footnote nobody ever expected to be invoked. Rumors swirled that his people were failing, their birth rates plummeting. This was not an act of romance or alliance. It was an act of pure desperation. It had absolutely nothing to do with me. "Better you than me," whispered Orson, a fellow scholar whose natural scent of lavender and rain had soured with anxiety. "They say his heart is carved from glacier ice and his temper is a winter storm. He is an alpha in need of an heir," I replied, my eyes never leaving the delicate script of the poem before me. "He will seek the most potent scent, the most robust constitution." This ceremony is a biological imperative dressed up in the trappings of political theater. It is of no consequence to me whatsoever. My defiance was my armor, polished over years to a maraschine. If I could not participate in their world, I would be its most astute and detached observer. I refused to grant them the satisfaction of witnessing my longing. The day of the selection arrived like a slow creeping fever. We were stripped of our simple scholars' robes, bathed in water scented with moonpetal and rose, and then dressed in ceremonial white silks that felt utterly alien against my skin. The fine fabric hung loosely on my thin frame, making me feel like a child playing dress-up. I caught my reflection in the polished silver of a water basin, a pale, dark-haired boy with eyes that held far too much knowledge and a body that held none of the world or Euro's trade's essential perfumes. The heavy, dark bracer on my wrist was a stark, ugly slash against the pristine white of the silk. A soft-hearted beater attendant tried to cover it with a longer ruffle of sleeve. "It cannot be removed," I stated, my voice devoid of emotion. She flinched as if struck and scurried away. We were led into the great hall, a cavernous space whose high walls were lined with the portraits of the stern-faced alphas who had founded this institution. We were arranged in a long, silent line, a sad bouquet of unwanted flowers waiting to be inspected. As always, I was placed at the very end of the line, an afterthought. The great oak doors groaned open, and a palpable chill swept through the hall, a premonition of the man who now entered. For the very first time, I felt a tremor of something other than detached analysis. It wasn't fear. It was Euro's appraisal. He was precisely as the stories had painted him, tall and broad-shouldered, draped in the black and gray furs of his homeland. His face was a landscape of sharp angles and hard planes, bisected by a scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, lending his features a permanently grim cast. His hair was the color of iron filings, and his eyes, as they swept across the room, were the cold, clear gray of a winter sky just before a blizzard. He moved with the predatory grace of a wolf, a man utterly at ease with his own power, radiating an aura of command so potent it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the room. His scent was sharp and clean, like glacial ice and pine needles, with a subtle undercurrent of something metallic and sorrowful, like old iron and lingering grief. He began his inspection, walking slowly down the line of trembling omegas. He did not speak. He simply paused before each one, his gaze clinical and impersonal, his nostrils flaring slightly as he assessed their scent. One by one, a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of his head, and he would move on, leaving a trail of crushed hope and quiet devastation in his wake. He was a man performing a distasteful but necessary duty, and his impatience was a palpable force in the air. My heart, which had been so steady and scholarly, began a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. It wasn't the fear of being chosen, but the dread of the impending public humiliation of having my nothingness confirmed by the most powerful alpha on the continent. Finally, he stood before me. I lifted my chin, forcing myself to meet his gaze. I would not cower. His gray eyes swept over me, cold and immediately dismissive. They catalogued my thin frame, my scholarly pallor, and the defiant set of my jaw. I saw a flicker of something in their depths, a Euro's annoyance, surprise, a circumflex Euros that I met his gaze so readily instead of looking at the floor. He inhaled deeply, and I watched the subtle shift in his expression, the furrowing of his brow as he encountered the absolute void where assent was supposed to be, the slight, disdainful curl of his lip. It was a look I had seen 1,000 times before. It was the look of someone finding something fundamentally, irreparably wrong. He turned away without a single word. It was over. A bitter, familiar sting of resignation settled in my chest. But as he turned, his gauntlet made contact with my bracer, and my world ended. After his thunderous declaration, I was dragged away from the broken silence of my life. My mother's mysterious promise shattered at my feet. I was thrust into the heart of a storm I couldn't possibly comprehend. The scent of pine and ice and ancient grief enveloped me, and for the first time I knew what it felt like to be truly, terrifyingly noticed. The journey north was an extended study in grim, oppressive silence. I was bundled into a heavily insulated carriage, its interior lined with thick furs that did little to ward off the bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the encroaching winter and everything to do with the man who rode alongside. Waylon was a silent, imposing figure on a massive black warhorse, a silhouette against the bleak, unforgiving landscape. He never spoke to me. He never even glanced in my direction. And yet, I felt his presence like a brand on my skin, a constant, suffocating awareness. My defiance, the only shield I had ever possessed, had been shattered along with my bracer. In its place was a maelstrom of confusion, and a fear so profound it bordered on paralysis. My own body was a stranger to me. The scent, my scent, poured from me in an invisible, uncontrollable torrent. It felt like shouting a secret I had never even known I possessed in the middle of a crowded room. I pressed my face against the cold glass of the carriage window, watching the rolling green hills and gentle forests of the south give way to jagged peaks and stark, pine-choked valleys. This was his land, the northern wastes. It was as beautiful as it was severe. We traveled for 3 days. On the third night, we made camp in a sheltered basin. I had barely touched my food, my stomach a tight, anxious knot. A beater guard brought me a bowl of stew, his eyes respectfully downcast, his entire posture a carefully controlled study in deference and awe. It was maddening. I was still Amir, the scholar, the oddity. But now my brokenness had a different, more revered name. I couldn't stand it. Pushing aside the offered meal, I unlatched the carriage door and stepped out into the frigid night air. The sharp cold was a welcome shock to my senses. Waylon stood by the roaring fire, his broad back to me as he stared into the flames. My voice, when I finally found it, was thin but steady. "I require answers, Lord Commander." He turned slowly. In the flickering firelight, the scar on his face seemed to pull his features into an even deeper scowl. "You require nothing. You will be told what you need to know, when I deem it necessary for you to know it." "That is unacceptable," I said, taking a bold step closer. The guards around the camp tensed. but Waylon waved them back with an almost imperceptible flick of his hand. You have ripped me from the only home I have ever known, claimed me as if I were a piece of property. I am a scholar, not a broodmare. My mind functions on information, not on blind obedience. To withhold it is to treat me as less than sentient. A flicker of something Euro's surprise, perhaps even grudging respect Euro's, crossed his face before it was extinguished by his habitual severity. Your home was a prison designed to keep you hidden. Your sentience is now a matter of state security. What you are is a key. My key, and I will not risk losing you to either ignorance or impulse. A key to what? I pressed, my voice rising with frustration. What am I? He strode toward me until he was towering over me, his shadow swallowing me whole. His scent, that clean, cold scent of ice and pine, washed over me, and my own treacherous scent flared in response, an instinctual answer to his challenge. A deep, primal part of me, a part I never knew existed, wanted to submit, to lower my eyes and bare my throat. I forced myself to hold his gaze. You, he said, his voice a low growl that vibrated in my very bones, are a prime omega, a legend, a myth made flesh. Something that was supposed to have been hunted to extinction centuries ago. You are the only thing that can save my people from the curse that is wiping us from existence. The words hung in the frozen air between us. Curse, prime omega. Save his people. It was the stuff of the epic poems I had spent my life studying, not the fabric of my quiet, scentless reality. I don't understand, I whispered, the defiance finally cracking under the impossible weight of his words. You will, he said, his expression unreadable in the dancing firelight. And with that, he turned and walked back to the fire, leaving me shivering in the darkness, utterly alone with the impossible burden he had just placed upon me. The fortress, when we finally reached it, was not our fortress at all. It was a city, carved into the very heart of a mountain, a breathtaking marvel of ancient engineering that spoke of a power and prosperity long since faded. Great spans of black stone arched over deep chasms, and waterfalls, frozen now into spectacular curtains of shimmering ice, cascaded down its sides. But inside, the grandeur was overshadowed by a pervasive, suffocating melancholy. The vast halls were eerily quiet. The faces of the people were grim, their sense muted with a shared, chronic despair. And I saw it immediately, a detail so jarring it stole my breath. There were no children, not a single one. I was taken directly to the medical wing, a place that smelled of antiseptic herbs and deep-seated hopelessness. The head healer was an old Ometer woman named Jalen. Her own scent was faded like old parchment, smelling of dried herbs and dust, but her eyes were sharp and fiercely intelligent. She examined me not as a patient, but as a priceless, delicate artifact that might shatter at the slightest touch. She took a sample of my blood, her touch surprisingly gentle. She studied the shattered remains of my bracer, which Waylon had brought in a velvet-lined box. Her sharp eyes scanned the runes, her lips moving silently as she deciphered their purpose. The suppressor was masterfully woven, she murmured, her gaze shifting from the broken metal to me with a look of profound awe. An act of incredible magical skill and incredible desperation. It's like trying to hide the sun under a bushel basket. She looked at Waylon. The legends are true, my lord. His blood runs pure. It's free of the toxin. He is the cure. The curse, Waylon corrected, his voice hard as flint. Call it what it is, Jalen. A curse. A curse, then, she agreed, her expression softening as she turned back to me. Your mother must have loved you very much, child, to go to such extraordinary lengths to hide you. My mother, the words struck me like a physical blow. She hadn't hidden me because I was broken or floored. She had hidden me because I was Euros precious. The thought was so foreign, so utterly alien to my entire sense of self, that my mind couldn't fully process it. I was given chambers more luxurious than any room in the scriptorium. A fire roared in a massive hearth. The bed was piled high with soft furs, and a balcony offered a breathtaking, panoramic view of the snow-covered valley below. It was, without a doubt, a beautiful cage. I spent the next few days in a haze, devouring every book they brought me on the history of the northern wastes, on the legends of prime omegas. The more I read, the more fantastical my situation became. Primes were not just exceptionally fertile, their very presence was said to heal the land itself, their magic intrinsically tied to the life force of their territory. Their bond with an Alpha was the most powerful union possible, capable of performing miracles. And they had all been hunted down and slaughtered by a rival clan, the Sunstone Dominion, during the Unification Wars, by those who feared their incredible power. Waylon and I fell into a strange pattern. He would visit me each evening. Our conversations were less like discussions and more like intellectual sparring matches. I demanded information, theories, data. He provided it grudgingly, parrying my questions with his own about my life, my studies, my mother. He was trying to understand me, the strange, defiant scholar who was inexplicably supposed to be his people Eurostrade's salvation. "You are not like any Omega I have ever known," he said one night, frustration lacing his tone. He was pacing restlessly before the fire, a caged wolf in his own home. "I was not raised to be," I retorted from my seat by the window. "I was raised to be a scholar. I was taught to question, to analyze, to deconstruct. You cannot expect me to simply accept a fate that is based on myth and biological imperative. It is not myth," he snarled, whirling to face me, his control finally snapping. "My people are dying. My first mate, my Soma Euros, they did not die in the war. That was a lie I told the world to hide our weakness. They wasted away from Thesa Euros, this creeping blight that robs us of our future. I have to believe in the myths, because pragmatism has given me nothing but ashes." The raw, undiluted pain in his voice silenced me. For the first time, I saw past the formidable Lord Commander to the grieving man beneath the armor. I saw the Alpha who had lost everything and was now pinning all his desperate hopes on a stranger he barely understood. The breakthrough came nearly 3 weeks after my arrival. One of Waylina Eurostrade's scholars, an elderly beater named Elen with ink-stained fingers and a quiet, focused energy, requested an urgent audience. She entered my chambers, bowing low. "My lords," she said, her voice trembling with excitement as she addressed both me and Waylon. "The bracer! We found something." She laid a piece of parchment on the table. It was a rubbing taken from the inside of the bracer, where the metal had been thinnest. The intense heat from my released power had brought out a hidden inscription, written in a complex cipher I recognized instantly. It was my mother Eurostrade's private scholarly code. My hands trembled as I translated the tiny, elegant script. It was a confession. She had been a mage from the Sunstone Dominion. Her family, she wrote, was a secret, captive bloodline of primes the Dominion had held for generations, a living weapon they were trying to perfect. They hadn't just hunted the other primes, they had stolen their power while preserving one line for their own twisted ambitions. She was meant to be a tool, but she chose to be a mother. She had discovered their final solution, a curse, a slow-acting magical toxin they had been secretly releasing into the North Eurostrade's water supply for decades. A poison designed to slowly and irreversibly sterilize their ancient rivals. She had fled with me, her infant son, and hidden me, suppressing my nature to save me from a fate worse than death. She betrayed her own people to save mine. Waylon breathed, his voice thick with disbelief and awe. She chose her son over a clan of murderers. I corrected him sharply, my heart aching with a fierce, protective love for the mother I barely remembered and the impossible choice she had faced. The revelation hung in the air, changing everything. This was no longer a matter of myth and prophecy, but of a clandestine war fought in the shadows. That night, the dynamic between us shifted irrevocably. The intellectual sparring matches ceased, replaced by the shared, urgent purpose of a war council. We were no longer commander and captive, but two minds focused on a single, insidious enemy. The Fortress Eurostrade's vast, cold library became our war room. The curse is a parasitic magical matrix, I explained 2 nights later, my fingers tracing a complex diagram I had drawn based on my mother's notes. We were surrounded by towering stacks of scrolls, the candlelight casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. It's woven into the very ley lines of the land. Waylon leaned over my shoulder to get a closer look, his proximity a solid wall of warmth that no longer felt threatening. His scent of pine and ice was a familiar, grounding presence. It doesn't just poison the water, it leaches the vitality from the land itself, and from your people who are so deeply tied to it. So, flushing the water sources would accomplish nothing, he stated. It wasn't a question. Nothing, I confirmed. It would be like trying to cure a disease by washing the patient's clothes. The sickness is inside. It must be unraveled from within. I expected an order, a demand for a solution. Instead, he surprised me. My mate, Ethel, she was a cartographer, he said, his voice a low, rough rumble. She believed you could find the soul of a place by tracing its lines. She would have been fascinated by you. It was the first time he had mentioned her by name, an unexpected offering of vulnerability that completely disarmed me. The truth is in the intent, not the image, I murmured, unconsciously echoing my own mother's words. A faint, sad smile touched his lips for a fleeting moment. Exactly. In that moment, we were not our prime omega and an alpha commander. We were just two people, haunted by the legacies of the women who had shaped us, trying desperately to read a map to a future that seemed all but impossible. A few days later, Waylon led me to a wing of the fortress I had not yet seen. It was unnervingly quiet, the air thick with a preserved stillness. The halls were lined with smaller doors, and the stone carvings were of animals and playing children. It was the nursery wing, and it was completely empty. He pushed open one door into a room where dust motes danced in the pale light from a high window. Everything was perfectly preserved, a small wooden mobile of carved wolves, a shelf of children's story scrolls, and in the center of the room, a cradle, wrought from dark mountain wood and polished to a soft sheen. I carved this myself, Waylon said, his voice rough with a decade of unshed grief. He ran a hand over the smooth wood of the cradle's headboard. For Cale, my son, he was only 4 when the sickness took him. He had his mother's hands euros always smudging her maps. The clinical, academic nature of the curse fell away, replaced by the devastating reality of this empty room. This was not our political problem to be solved. It was a heart-deep wound that had been festering for 10 long years. He wasn't just fighting for his people, he was fighting the ghosts of his family. I reached out, my fingers hovering for a moment before I placed my hand gently on his arm. I had no words of comfort to offer. My life had been one of absence, but his had been one of loss, a far crueler fate. He did not pull away. We stood there together in the silent, dust-filled room, and I felt my purpose solidify. My mother had hidden me to save me, but I would fight to save them. Leaving the nursery, the silence between us was different. It was no longer the tense quiet of strangers, but the solemn quiet of shared grief. Before, the curse had been a fascinating, terrible puzzle to be solved. Now I had seen its true cost written in the dust of an empty cradle. Our alliance, forged in the library over maps and scrolls, was now cemented by a pain I suddenly felt, a desperate, burning need to heal. My newfound purpose was swiftly followed by a change that was far more personal and far more terrifying. That evening, the shock of my new reality and the sudden freedom from a lifetime of magical suppression finally threw my body into chaos. It started as a deep, radiating heat in my jaw, a strange restlessness that had me pacing my chambers like a trapped animal. Alarmed by my distress, Waylon summoned Jalen. She took one look at me, her wise old eyes full of a new kind of pity. "It is your first true heat," she said gently. "Without the suppressor, your body is finally doing what it was born to do. I am afraid it will be Euros overwhelming." It was more than overwhelming. It was an inferno, a tidal wave of physical need so powerful it completely obliterated thought, leaving only raw, primal instinct in its wake. My luxurious chambers became a prison of torment. The scent I produced intensified 1,000-fold, becoming a desperate, cloying plea for an alpha. For my alpha. Through the haze of pain and instinctual need, I was aware of him. Waylon. He stood guard outside my door for hours on end, the scent of his own struggle, of his iron-willed control, seeping under the door. He was a man caught between his duty to protect me and his own powerful alpha instinct to answer the call I was screaming into the world. On the second day, when I was certain I would go mad from the agony, the door opened. He stood there, his face carved from stone, his gray eyes burning with a fire that mirrored my own. "I cannot leave you to suffer this alone," he rasped, his voice rough with strain. He did not come to me as a conqueror or as an alpha claiming his due. He came as a comfort. He brought cool cloths for my fevered head. He spoke to me in low, soothing tones, telling me stories of the constellations as they appeared over the northern peaks. And when the waves of need became unbearable, he gathered me into his arms, his strong, steady presence an anchor in the storm of my own body. He simply held me, letting me scent him, his clean, cold fragrance a balm to my fevered senses. He did not take me. He did not claim me in the way both his body and mine were screaming for. He simply Euros held me. In that furnace of instinct and vulnerability, a new kind of bond was forged. It was not a bond of politics or prophecy, but one born of shared suffering and unexpected tenderness. In his arms, I saw the man, not the commander, and he, I think, finally saw me. Amir, not the key, not the prime, just Amir. As the fever finally broke, leaving me weak and spent in his arms, I knew with absolute certainty that my life, and his, had been irrevocably, terrifyingly, beautifully altered. A week passed in a strange, quiet limbo. The fortress held its breath around me. I was no longer a prisoner, but I was not yet a part of this world. I spent most of my time in the vast, cold library, burying myself in the familiar comfort of research, but the words on the page often blurred. The scent of old parchment, once my only world, now had to compete with the ghost of pine and ice that seemed to linger in my senses. A constant reminder of Waylina Eurostrade's presence during my delirium. One night, the library doors creaked open. I didn't Eurostrade look up from the map of ley lines I was studying, assuming it was a servant with a fresh candle. But the footsteps were too heavy, the silence that followed too deliberate. You should not push yourself so hard. Waylina Eurostrade's voice was a low rumble in the quiet. Knowledge is the only weapon I possess, I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. I was frustrated. My body felt stronger, my senses were preternaturally sharp, but the magic the legends spoke of, the power to heal a land, felt like a phantom limb. I could feel its presence, but I could not command it. A weapon I'm finding increasingly inadequate. He moved to stand beside my table, his presence a solid wall of warmth in the chilly air. His gaze fell upon the complex diagram I had been struggling with. You look at this power as an enemy to be conquered, he observed, his voice thoughtful. You are trying to command an army when you have not yet learned to command a single soldier. He looked at my hands resting on the parchment, fingers stained with ink. You feel like an imposter, don't you? In this new body, in this new role. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple, soul-bearing statement of fact. And it was true. Their hope was a crushing weight. The future of a nation rested on a power I didn't Eurostrade understand and couldn't Eurostrade control. After a lifetime of being defined by my mind, I was now expected to perform a miracle with a part of myself I had never known existed. How can I command it when I don't even know what it is? I finally admitted, the words a quiet surrender. Waylina Eurostrade's large, calloused hand, the hand of a warrior and a leader, gently covered mine on the table. The contact sent a jolt of warmth through me that had nothing to do with heat or instinct, and everything to do with a nascent, terrifying sense of connection. You have spent your entire life in here, he said, his gaze sweeping across the endless rows of books. You learned about the world through ink and parchment. But this power, it is not of the mind. It is of the earth, of the stone, of the ice. It is the soul of my land, and it is now the soul of you. You will never command it by reading about it. He paused, his grip on my hand firming slightly, a silent promise. You must learn to listen to it, and I will help you. They were no longer the words of a commander to his asset. They were the words of a partner. A new journey was beginning, not across a continent, but into the uncharted territory of my own soul, with the unlikeliest of guides by my side. The scholar and the warrior, bound together by a dying land and the ghost of a love that was just beginning to stir. The story of Amir and Waylin has only just begun. Their alliance was forged in desperation. But now, a fragile trust is beginning to form between them. Do you believe a bond born from duty and shared grief can truly blossom into love? What challenges do you think they'll face when they attempt to connect with a land's ancient magic together? Let me know your theories and thoughts in the comments below. If you were captivated by their journey and want to see what happens next, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more.